Ranger Sarah Mitchell's radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m., her coffee mug freezing halfway to her lips as the dispatcher's voice cut through the morning silence. Anonymous caller reports smell of death at the old Sullivan property on County Road 47. It wasn't another dead deer. It was something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Deputy Earl Jenkins stumbled backward from the rusted gate, his weathered hands trembling as he covered his mouth. The metallic clang of his dropped flashlight echoed across the desolate Texas landscape, followed by the sound of retching. Sarah stepped closer to the makeshift cage and saw what had broken a 30-year veteran of rural law enforcement. A massive Brahman bull, once magnificent, now crammed into a space barely large enough for a calf, his distinctive hump grotesquely flattened against the low metal ceiling. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Call backup. Now." 10 years. How long had this magnificent creature been trapped in this hell? And what kind of monster could do this to something so helpless? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Sullivan property stretched across 43 acres of drought-cracked Texas earth, where mesquite trees cast skeletal shadows under an unforgiving sun. Sarah Mitchell had seen her share of animal cruelty cases in her 15 years as a ranger, but nothing had prepared her for the sight that greeted her behind the collapsing barn. The makeshift cage, constructed from rusted cattle panels and corrugated metal, sat like a monument to human cruelty in the middle of what had once been a thriving cattle operation. Thunder, as the locals had once called him, was a shadow of his former glory. The Brahman bull's once pristine gray coat was stained brown with years of accumulated filth, his massive frame compressed into a space that forced him to keep his head perpetually lowered. His distinctive hump, a hallmark of his noble breed, bore the permanent indentations of the low ceiling that had pressed against it for a decade. Yet his dark eyes still held an intelligence that made Sarah's chest tighten with recognition. This wasn't just an animal. This was a sentient being who understood his captivity. Sarah had grown up on her grandfather's ranch just 50 miles south, where cattle were treated with the respect befitting creatures that sustained generations of families. At 45, she carried the weight of a failed marriage and the constant ache of childlessness, channeling her maternal instincts into her work with animals who couldn't speak for themselves. 2 years ago, she'd lost her own horse, Dancer, to colic, and the guilt of not recognizing the symptoms early enough still haunted her sleepless nights. Marcus Sullivan emerged from the farmhouse like a man walking to his execution, his shoulders hunched against more than just the morning chill. At 52, he looked older than his years, his face weathered by sun and something deeper, a pain that seemed to emanate from his very bones. He clutched a beer bottle despite the early hour, his movements deliberate and careful, like a man afraid of what he might do if he moved too quickly. "You folks need to get off my property," Marcus said, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man who'd rehearsed this moment countless times. His eyes never quite met Sarah's, instead fixing on a point somewhere over her shoulder. Earl Jenkins, who'd served as county sheriff for 3 decades, had seen Marcus grow from a promising young ranch hand into whatever broken thing stood before them now. "Marcus, son, we got reports about animal neglect. We're obligated to investigate." The neighboring property revealed another piece of the puzzle when Ethel Thompson stepped onto her porch, her silver hair catching the morning light. At 73, she moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate the world alone since her husband Harold's death 5 years prior. Her house, a modest 2-bedroom ranch style, sat on 5 acres that she maintained with the obsessive care of someone who needed routine to survive the silence. What none of them knew yet was that Ethel carried her own devastating secret, one that connected her to the suffering animal in ways that would soon tear open old wounds she'd spent years trying to heal, The morning sun climbed higher as Sarah approached the cage, each step revealing new horrors that made her stomach clench. Thunder's water trough was green with algae, and what passed for food appeared to be moldy hay scattered carelessly on the ground. The smell hit her in waves: ammonia, decay, and something else that spoke of prolonged suffering. She pulled out her phone to document the scene, but her hand shook so badly she could barely hold the device steady. "How long has he been like this?" Sarah's voice carried across the silent property, cutting through the morning air like a blade. Marcus took a long pull from his beer bottle, his knuckles white against the brown glass. "That's none of your damn business. Thunder belongs to me, legal and proper. Got the papers to prove it." But even as he spoke those words, something flickered across his face. A micro-expression of pain so deep it seemed to physically hurt him. Sarah had interviewed enough suspects to recognize the look of a man at war with himself. This wasn't simple cruelty. This was something far more complex and infinitely more tragic. Thunder lifted his massive head as much as the low ceiling would allow, and his dark eyes fixed on Marcus with an expression that stopped Sarah cold. There was no fear there, no hatred. Instead, she saw something that defied everything she thought she knew about abused animals. The bull's gaze held what could only be described as protective concern, as if this magnificent creature was worried about the man who had imprisoned him. "I've been watching this situation for 2 years," Ethel Thompson's voice carried across the fence line, her words measured and careful. She approached the group with the deliberate pace of someone who'd spent decades making life-and-death decisions. "Marcus, you know this can't continue." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. 2 years. "You've known about this for 2 years and never reported it?" Ethel's weathered hands gripped the fence rail, her knuckles as white as Marcus's had been moments before. "It's complicated. More complicated than you could possibly understand." Earl Jenkins removed his hat and ran his fingers through his thinning gray hair, a gesture Sarah recognized from years of watching him process difficult situations. "Marcus, son, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. Your daddy raised you better than this. What happened here?" At the mention of his father, Marcus's entire body went rigid. The beer bottle slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hard-packed earth with a sound like breaking bones. "Don't," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't you dare bring him into this." Thunder shifted in his cramped prison, a movement that should have been impossible given the constraints of his cage. The bull managed to angle his body toward Marcus, extending his neck as far as the cruel confines would allow. His massive head came to rest against the cage bars, positioned so that if Marcus chose to reach out, he could touch the animal's forehead. Sarah watched this interaction with growing bewilderment. Every instinct told her she was witnessing something unprecedented, an abused animal offering comfort to his abuser. It contradicted everything she'd learned about animal behavior, everything she'd seen in 15 years of rescue work. "There was an accident," Ethel said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd held secrets too long. 10 years ago. Marcus's father, Benjamin Sullivan, was one of the finest men this county ever produced. He raised prize-winning Brahman cattle, and Thunder here was the crown jewel of his herd. Marcus made a sound somewhere between a sob and a growl. "Stop talking. Just stop." But Ethel continued, her clinical training evident in her ability to deliver difficult information with steady precision. "Benjamin died in a flash flood trying to save his cattle. Thunder was the only one who survived." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Sarah looked from Marcus to Thunder and back again, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "You blame him," she whispered. "You blame Thunder for your father's death." Marcus's laugh was hollow, broken. Blame him. Lady, you don't understand anything. I don't blame Thunder. I blame myself. Thunder made a low sound, somewhere between a moo and a whimper, a vocalization Sarah had never heard from cattle before. The bull pressed harder against the cage bars as if trying to reach the man who had become both his captor and fellow prisoner. Earl stepped forward, his sheriff's training warring with 30 years of knowing this family. Marcus, we need to talk about getting Thunder proper medical attention. Look at him. He's got infections, malnutrition, God knows what else. You don't get it, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger, more desperate. None of you get it. I can't let him go. If I let him go, then Daddy really died for nothing. The logic was twisted, broken, but Sarah recognized the pain behind it. She'd seen it in her own mirror after Dancer died, the need to hold on to suffering because letting go felt like betrayal. The legal complications began almost immediately. Earl's radio crackled with updates from the county courthouse. Marcus Sullivan held clear title to both the property and the bull, purchased legitimately from his father's estate 10 years prior. Without evidence of immediate life-threatening conditions, they needed either a court order or Marcus's voluntary surrender to remove Thunder from the premises. The earliest they could get before a judge was Monday morning, giving them a 48-hour window where Thunder remained trapped in legal limbo. 48 hours, Sarah repeated, staring at Thunder's labored breathing. He might not have 48 hours. Dr. Amanda Chen, the county's only large animal veterinarian, arrived within the hour, her truck kicking up dust clouds as she navigated the rutted driveway. She took one look at Thunder, and her professional composure cracked. In 30 years of practice, I've never seen anything this severe in a living animal. How is he even standing? The examination had to be conducted through the cage bars, Thunder too large and the space too confined for a proper assessment. What Dr. Chen found painted a grim picture: severe malnutrition, infected pressure sores where his body contacted the cage, possible respiratory issues from prolonged exposure to ammonia fumes, and psychological trauma that manifested in his reluctance to make eye contact with anyone except Marcus. His body condition score is maybe a 2 out of 9, Dr. Chen explained to the gathering crowd, her voice clinical, but her eyes bright with unshed tears. Normal weight for a Brahman bull his age should be around 1,800 pounds. I'd estimate he's closer to 900. His hooves haven't been trimmed in years. His teeth show signs of nutritional deficiency, and those pressure sores are infected. Marcus stood 20 feet away, close enough to hear every word, but far enough to maintain the illusion of detachment. His hand shook as he lit his third cigarette in an hour, the smoke creating a hazy barrier between him and the reality of Thunder's condition. "Can you treat him here?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from Dr. Chen's expression. "I can provide some immediate relief, antibiotics, pain medication, wound care, but he needs to be moved to a facility where he can be properly examined and treated. This cage," Dr. Chen gestured helplessly at the cramped prison, "this cage is killing him by degrees." Thunder's eyes followed Marcus's movements with an intensity that unnerved everyone present. When Marcus moved closer to the cage, the bull's breathing seemed to calm. When Marcus retreated, Thunder became agitated, shifting his weight and making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like calls for attention. Ethel Thompson watched this interaction with the trained eye of someone who'd spent 40 years as a veterinarian before her retirement. She'd seen the bond between animals and their owners manifest in countless ways, but never quite like this. Thunder wasn't just emotionally attached to Marcus. He was psychologically dependent on him in a way that suggested trauma bonding on both sides. "Marcus!" Ethel called across the yard, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "We need to talk. Privately." The two of them walked to the edge of the property, their conversation conducted in hushed tones that carried fragments on the wind. Sarah caught pieces. "Your father would be ashamed. That bull is suffering because of your guilt. 10 years is enough." When they returned, Marcus's face was pale, his jaw set in the stubborn line Sarah recognized from her own father when he'd made a difficult decision. "I'll allow treatment," he announced, "but Thunder doesn't leave my property, Doctor. Chen can do whatever she needs to do, but he stays here." It was a compromise that satisfied no one but provided Thunder with immediate medical relief. Dr. Chen worked for 3 hours, administering antibiotics and pain medication, cleaning and dressing the worst of the pressure sores, and providing Thunder with fresh water and high-quality feed. The bull's response was immediate and heartbreaking. He ate with the desperate hunger of someone who'd learned not to trust that food would come again. As evening approached, Sarah made a decision that would have consequences she couldn't yet imagine. "I'm staying tonight," she announced, pulling her sleeping bag from the truck. "Someone needs to monitor Thunder's response to the medication." Earl raised an eyebrow. "Sarah, that's not protocol." "We don't have legal authority to maintain a presence on private property without the owner's consent." "Then I'm asking for consent." Sarah turned to Marcus, who stood silhouetted against the setting sun like a scarecrow in his own field. "Will you let me stay? Just to make sure Thunder's okay through the night?" Marcus studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to read her motivations. Finally, he nodded. "You can stay, but you don't go near Thunder without me present, and you don't touch anything else on my property." As darkness fell over the Texas countryside, Sarah set up her makeshift camp 30 feet from Thunder's cage. The bull had settled as much as his cramped quarters allowed, but his eyes remained open, watching the interplay of shadows cast by her battery-powered lantern. Every hour she checked on him, noting his breathing, his position, any signs of distress or improvement. Around midnight, she heard footsteps and looked up to see Marcus approaching with 2 cups of coffee. He offered her one without speaking, then settled onto an overturned bucket where he could see Thunder clearly. "He used to run," Marcus said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Daddy and I would turn him out in the big pasture, and he'd run like something wild. Pure joy, you know, just for the feeling of his own strength." Sarah sipped her coffee, recognizing the moment for what it was, the first crack in a wall that had taken 10 years to build. "Tell me about your father," she said gently. Marcus was quiet for so long, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came haltingly, like a confession torn from somewhere deep. "Benjamin Sullivan was the best man I ever knew, and I got him killed." The second day dawned with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep into everyone's bones. Sarah woke to find Marcus already sitting beside Thunder's cage, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in his hands like a prayer. The bull had managed to sleep fitfully, his massive frame somehow finding rest despite the impossible constraints. The antibiotics Dr. Chen had administered were working. Thunder's breathing seemed easier, and he'd consumed all the fresh hay Marcus had quietly provided before dawn. By 7 a.m., the property was no longer the isolated pocket of suffering it had been 24 hours earlier. Word had spread through the tight-knit rural community with the speed that only genuine shock could generate. Pickup trucks lined the county road, their occupants maintaining a respectful distance, but clearly drawn by a mixture of curiosity and concern that spoke to something deeper than mere gossip. Sarah's phone had been buzzing constantly since sunrise. Local news stations, animal rights organizations, and social media influencers had somehow caught wind of Thunder's story. The hashtag #FreeThunder was already trending across Texas, with photos of the magnificent bull in his cramped prison spreading across Facebook and Instagram like wildfire. The image that seemed to capture the most attention was one Sarah hadn't even realized someone had taken. Thunder pressing his massive head against the cage bars while Marcus stood just out of reach, both of their faces etched with a pain so profound it transcended species. "This is getting out of hand," Earl muttered, watching a news van from Austin pull up to the property line. "We've got reporters, protesters, and every animal rights activist in a 3-state radius heading this way." The first wave of protesters arrived at 10 a.m., a mix of college students from the University of Texas and graying activists who'd been fighting for animal rights since before some of the students were born. And they carried signs with messages ranging from "animals are not property" to "justice for Thunder," their chants echoing across the drought-stricken landscape like a modern-day revival meeting. But the real game-changer came in the form of Marcus's ex-wife, Patricia Sullivan, who arrived in a dust-covered Honda Civic with Oklahoma plates and 15 years of unresolved anger etched into every line of her face. Sarah watched as the woman who'd once shared Marcus's name and presumably his bed took in the scene with undisguised horror. "Jesus Christ, Marcus," Patricia breathed, her voice carrying across the yard with the force of a physical blow. "What have you done?" Patricia was 51, with the kind of weathered beauty that spoke of years spent working outdoors and caring for others. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes suggested she'd driven straight through the night to get here. But it was her eyes that caught Sarah's attention. They held the particular pain of someone who'd loved Marcus Sullivan and watched him destroy himself. "You don't belong here, Patty," Marcus said. But his voice lacked conviction. He looked like a man who'd been expecting this confrontation for years. "I belong here more than you know," Patricia replied, pulling a manila envelope from her purse with shaking hands. "I've been carrying this for 5 years, waiting for the right moment, waiting for you to come to your senses on your own." The envelope contained insurance documents that would change everything. Benjamin Sullivan had carried a substantial life insurance policy, but Marcus had never filed the claim. The payout, nearly $200,000, had been sitting in legal limbo for a decade, waiting for someone to complete the paperwork and face the reality of Benjamin's death. "You could have paid off the ranch," Patricia said, her voice breaking. "You could have honored your father's memory by continuing his work, building something beautiful. Instead, you chose to torture yourself and that poor animal." Dr. Chen arrived for her second day of treatment to find Thunder's condition marginally improved, but his psychological state more complex than she'd initially assessed. "His physical responses are encouraging," she explained to the growing crowd of concerned onlookers. "But there's something unusual happening here. Most severely abused animals show fear or aggression toward their abusers. Thunder shows what I can only describe as codependency." The observation was proven accurate when a well-meaning protester attempted to approach Thunder's cage with an offering of fresh apples. The bull became agitated, backing against the far corner of his prison and making distressed vocalizations until Marcus appeared in his line of sight. Only then did Thunder calm down, accepting the fruit through the bars, but never taking his eyes off the man who'd kept him captive. Ethel Thompson had been unusually quiet throughout the morning, but as the crowd grew and the media attention intensified, she made a decision that surprised everyone. She approached the news cameras with the purposeful stride of someone who'd spent decades delivering difficult information to grieving families. "I'm Dr. Ethel Thompson," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of her former profession. "I was the senior veterinarian for this county for 40 years before my retirement. I've been monitoring Thunder's situation for the past 2 years, and I want to set the record straight about what's happening here." The revelation that she'd known about Thunder's condition for years created a firestorm of controversy. Animal rights activists turned their fury on her, demanding to know how a veterinarian could have allowed such suffering to continue. Ethel stood her ground, her clinical training evident in her ability to remain calm under pressure. "Marcus Sullivan is not a monster," she stated firmly. "He's a deeply traumatized man who's been carrying impossible guilt for 10 years. Thunder isn't just suffering from physical neglect. He's suffering from psychological trauma that mirrors his owners. Separating them without addressing the underlying trauma could kill them both." The crowd fell silent as Ethel continued, her words carrying the weight of professional expertise and personal pain. "Some of you want simple answers. Good guys and bad guys, victims and villains. But trauma doesn't work that way. Sometimes the person causing the pain is in just as much agony as the one receiving it." Sarah found herself thinking about her own divorce, her own guilt over Dancer's death, her own tendency to punish herself for perceived failures. How many cages had she built in her own life? How much of her dedication to saving animals was really about trying to save herself? The afternoon brought unexpected complications when a team of lawyers from the Texas Animal Rights Coalition arrived with paperwork demanding Thunder's immediate seizure. They'd found a legal precedent that would allow them to bypass the 48-hour waiting period if they could prove imminent danger to the animal's life. Marcus met this challenge with the first show of real fight he'd displayed since the ordeal began. "You want to take Thunder? You'll have to go through me first." It was Patricia who diffused the standoff with a revelation that changed everything. "The insurance money isn't the only thing Marcus has been hiding from," she announced, pulling out her phone and showing a video that made everyone present stop and stare. The video, dated 5 years earlier, showed Thunder in a different kind of enclosure, still confined, but in a larger space with clean bedding, fresh water, and regular food. More shocking was the audio, which captured Marcus talking to the bull in gentle, soothing tones, apologizing over and over again, explaining why he couldn't let him go. "Marcus has been taking care of Thunder this whole time," Patricia explained, her voice heavy with the weight of understanding that had taken her years to achieve. "Not well, not in a way that any of us would consider adequate, but he's been keeping Thunder alive when everything in his broken heart wanted to let him die." Because letting Thunder die would mean accepting that his father died for nothing. The psychological complexity of the situation began to dawn on everyone present. This wasn't simple animal abuse. This was a case study in how trauma perpetuates itself, how guilt can become a prison that confines both the guilty and the innocent. Dr. Chen approached Thunder's cage with renewed understanding, observing the subtle interactions between bull and man with the eye of someone trained to see beyond the obvious. "They're both prisoners," she murmured to Sarah. "Marcus built this cage as much for himself as for Thunder. The question is, how do we free them both?" As evening approached, the crowd began to thin, but the core group remained: Sarah, Earl, Dr. Chen, Ethel, Patricia, and Marcus. They formed an unlikely council around Thunder's cage, each bringing their own perspective to a problem that defied easy solutions. Thunder himself seemed to sense the shift in energy. For the first time since Sarah had arrived, the bull lifted his head as high as the cage would allow and looked directly at each person in turn. His dark eyes held an intelligence that was unmistakable, and when his gaze finally settled on Marcus, the expression was one of infinite patience and understanding. "He's waiting," Ethel observed quietly. "Thunder's been waiting for Marcus to forgive himself so they can both be free." The observation hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah realized that tomorrow would bring either breakthrough or tragedy. The legal pressure was mounting, Thunder's physical condition remained precarious, and Marcus was balanced on the edge of a psychological precipice that had been 10 years in the making. As night fell over the Texas countryside for the second time, Sarah once again set up her vigil beside Thunder's cage. But this time, she wasn't alone. Patricia had chosen to stay, setting up her own chair beside her ex-husband's, their shared history creating a buffer zone around Marcus that seemed to calm him. Ethel remained as well, her medical bag at the ready in case Thunder's condition deteriorated during the night. The bull settled into what passed for sleep in his cramped quarters, but his breathing remained labored, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Tomorrow would bring more protesters, more media attention, and more legal pressure. But beneath all the external chaos, the real drama was playing out in the space between a broken man and the magnificent animal who'd become both his victim and his fellow prisoner. Thunder's eyes remained open long into the night, watching over the humans who watched over him, all of them trapped in their own ways, all of them waiting for something that felt increasingly like a miracle. Dawn on the third day broke with an ominous stillness that made everyone's nerves feel stretched to the breaking point. Sarah woke to find Thunder standing motionless in his cage, his breathing shallow and rapid in a way that immediately set off every alarm bell in her mind. Dr. Chen was already examining him through the bars, her face grave as she checked his vital signs with the limited tools available. "His temperature's spiking," Dr. Chen announced, her voice cutting through the morning quiet like a death knell. "The infection is spreading faster than the antibiotics can handle it. If we don't get him to a proper facility within the next few hours—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood. The media circus had grown overnight into something resembling a small town. News vans from Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio created a semicircle around the property, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking sun. The protesters had organized themselves into shifts, ensuring that Thunder's story remained visible 24 hours a day. Someone had erected a shrine of sorts near the road, flowers, handwritten letters, children's drawings of bulls running free across endless pastures. Marcus emerged from his house looking like a man who'd aged a decade in 3 days. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, his face unshaven, his eyes holding the hollow look of someone operating on raw nerve and caffeine. But when he saw Thunder's condition, something shifted in his expression. A crack in the wall of guilt and self-imposed punishment that had defined him for 10 years. "He's dying," Marcus whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "God Almighty, he's really dying." Patricia moved to her ex-husband's side with the automatic response of someone who'd once promised to stand by him in sickness and in health. "Marcus, honey, you have to let them take him to the animal hospital. You have to let Dr. Chen do what she needs to do." "I can't," Marcus replied, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried for the past 3 days. "If I let him go, if I admit that keeping him here was wrong, then everything I've done, all the suffering, it was all for nothing." It was Earl Jenkins who provided the catalyst for what happened next. The old sheriff had been watching the proceedings with the patience of someone who'd learned that sometimes the best thing law enforcement could do was simply bear witness to human tragedy. But when his radio crackled with news from the courthouse, his weathered face went pale. "Marcus," Earl said slowly, "I just got word from Judge Harrison. The animal rights lawyers got their emergency injunction. They're coming with a court order and a cattle trailer in 2 hours. If Thunder's still in that cage when they arrive, you're going to be arrested for felony animal cruelty." The news hit Marcus like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his hand reaching out blindly until it found the fence post that had been holding him upright for 3 days. "Arrested," he repeated, as if the word were in a foreign language. "They're going to arrest me." "There's another way," Ethel Thompson said quietly, stepping forward with the manila envelope she'd been carrying since the first day. "Benjamin left something for you, Marcus. Something I've been holding on to, waiting for the right moment." The envelope was worn soft with age and handling, Benjamin Sullivan's name written across the front in faded blue ink. Inside was a single sheet of paper, his father's handwriting, dated just 3 months before the flood that claimed his life. Marcus's hands shook as he unfolded the letter, his lips moving silently as he read words that had been waiting 10 years to be heard. Son, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably blaming yourself for something that was never your fault. I know you, Marcus. I know how your mind works, how you carry responsibility for things beyond your control, but I need you to understand something. Loving Thunder, caring for our cattle, building this ranch together, none of that was a mistake. And if something happens to me tomorrow or 50 years from now, I want you to promise me you'll let Thunder run free. That bull deserves to feel the sun on his back and grass under his feet. Promise me, son. Promise me you'll choose love over guilt. The letter fell from Marcus's trembling fingers, and for the first time in 10 years, he began to cry. Not the silent tears of a man trying to maintain dignity, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose heart had finally broken open after being frozen in ice for a decade. Thunder responded to the sound with an agitation that bordered on panic. The massive bull pressed himself against the cage bars, stretching his neck as far as the confined space would allow, making soft lowing sounds that seemed designed to comfort rather than call for help. Even in his own suffering, Thunder was trying to take care of the man who'd kept him prisoner. "He forgives you," Patricia said softly, watching the interaction between her ex-husband and the bull with tears streaming down her face. "Look at him, Marcus. After everything you've put him through, he's trying to comfort you." Dr. Chen seized the moment with the instincts of someone trained to act when windows of opportunity opened. "Marcus, I need your permission right now to sedate Thunder and get him loaded onto a trailer. Every minute we wait decreases his chances of survival." Marcus looked up at her through his tears, his face a battlefield between 10 years of guilt and the desperate need to do something right. "If he dies," he whispered, "if Thunder dies because I waited too long, then you'll know you tried to save him," Sarah interjected, stepping forward with an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. "Marcus, I've been doing animal rescue for 15 years. I've seen what guilt does to people, how it turns love into poison. Your father's letter is telling you the truth. Thunder deserves to run free. But right now, he deserves to live." The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the tension like a blade. 3 cattle trailers and a convoy of official vehicles were making their way down the county road, dust clouds announcing their arrival like smoke signals. The court-ordered seizure team was arriving ahead of schedule. Marcus looked at Thunder one last time, seeing past the filth and suffering to the magnificent animal his father had loved. "Thunder," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the years of silence between them. "Thunder, I'm sorry." "God help me, I'm so sorry." Dr. Chen was already moving, her emergency kit in hand as she prepared the sedative that would allow Thunder to be safely transported. "Patricia, I need you to call ahead to the large animal hospital in Austin. Tell them we're coming in hot with a critical case. Sarah, help me coordinate with the trailer team." But as Dr. Chen approached with the sedative, Thunder did something that stopped everyone in their tracks. The bull, who had been passive and compliant for 10 years, suddenly backed away from the bars, his eyes wide with what could only be described as fear. Not fear of the needle or the medication, but fear of leaving the only world he'd known for a decade. "He's institutionalized," Ethel observed with clinical detachment. 10 years in that cage has become his entire reality. To Thunder, the outside world might seem more terrifying than his prison. Marcus understood immediately. He approached Thunder's cage slowly, his hands empty, his voice soft with the kind of gentleness that had been buried under guilt for too long. "It's okay, boy," he murmured, the words coming from a part of himself he'd thought was dead. "It's okay to be scared. But you have to trust me one more time. You have to let them help you." Thunder's dark eyes fixed on Marcus's face, and in that moment, everyone present witnessed something extraordinary. The bull pressed his massive head against the bars one final time, not seeking comfort, but offering it, as if he understood that Marcus needed this moment of connection as much as he did. "Now," Marcus said to Dr. Chen, his voice steady for the first time in 3 days. "Do it now, before I lose my nerve." The sedative took effect quickly, Thunder's massive frame slowly settling onto the filthy floor of his cage as the medication carried him into merciful unconsciousness. The process of cutting away the cage bars and loading him onto the trailer would take another hour, but the hardest part was over. After 10 years, Thunder was finally going to be free. As the convoy pulled away from the Sullivan property, Marcus stood in the empty space where Thunder's cage had been, Patricia's hand on his shoulder and his father's letter still clutched in his fist. The media circus was already following the trailer, eager to document Thunder's journey to recovery, but Marcus seemed oblivious to everything except the silence where Thunder's breathing had been for so long. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, his voice that of a man who'd forgotten how to imagine a future. "Now," Sarah replied, watching the dust settle over the empty space, "you both learn how to live free." The Austin Large Animal Hospital received Thunder like a casualty of war. Dr. Maria Santos, the lead veterinarian, had seen the viral videos and prepared her team for the worst. But nothing could have readied them for the reality of the magnificent Brahman bull who arrived unconscious on a stretcher designed for creatures half his size. His body was a roadmap of neglect, pressure sores that had gone untreated for years, hooves grown so long they'd begun to curl, and a muscle mass so diminished that his once proud frame looked like a shadow puppet of its former self. "Get him into Surgery Bay 3, Dr. Santos commanded, her team moving with the practiced efficiency of people who dedicated their lives to healing. "I want blood work, X-rays, and a full body scan." "This is going to be a long night." Marcus had insisted on following the convoy to Austin, Patricia driving while he sat in the passenger seat clutching his father's letter and staring out at the endless Texas landscape. Sarah rode with Earl in the sheriff's cruiser, all of them connected by invisible threads of responsibility and hope that felt more fragile than spider silk. The waiting room of the animal hospital became an unlikely gathering place for the strangest support group any of them had ever been part of. Word had spread through social media with viral intensity, and Thunder's story had touched something deep in the American psyche. Families drove hours to sit in plastic chairs, not because they knew Thunder personally, but because his story had become a symbol of something larger: redemption, forgiveness, second chances. 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez from San Antonio had convinced her parents to make the drive after seeing Thunder's picture on her mother's Facebook feed. She sat cross-legged on the hospital floor, carefully coloring a picture of a bull running through green pastures. "Is the bull going to be okay?" she asked Sarah with the directness that only children possessed. Sarah knelt beside the little girl, choosing her words carefully. "The doctors are doing everything they can to help him feel better. Sometimes when someone has been hurt for a long time, it takes a while to heal." "Like when my grandpa was sad after Grandma died?" Emma asked, her crayon pausing mid-stroke. "Yes," Sarah replied, understanding that this child had grasped something that many adults struggled with. "Exactly like that." Dr. Santos emerged from the surgical suite after 4 hours, her scrubs stained and her face etched with exhaustion. The waiting room fell silent as she approached Marcus, who had been pacing the same 10-foot path for most of the night. "Thunder is stable, but his condition is more complex than we initially thought," she began, her clinical training evident in her measured delivery. "The physical damage is extensive but treatable. What concerns me more is his psychological state. Even under sedation, his stress indicators remain elevated. His body is in fight or flight mode, but he has nowhere to run and no enemy to fight. Marcus slumped into a plastic chair that seemed too small for his frame. Is he going to die because of what I did to him? Dr. Santos studied Marcus with the same intensity she'd used to examine Thunder. Mr. Sullivan, I've been treating large animals for 23 years. I've seen abuse cases that would make you sick to your stomach. But I've never seen an animal respond to trauma the way Thunder has. Most severely abused animals either become aggressive or completely withdrawn. Thunder has somehow maintained his capacity for connection, for trust. That's not typical of an animal that's been simply tortured. The insight hit Marcus like a physical blow. He knew, he whispered. Thunder knew I wasn't trying to hurt him. He knew I was trying to keep him safe, even if I was doing it all wrong. Patricia had been silent for most of the night, but she moved to sit beside her ex-husband, her hand finding his with the muscle memory of 23 years of marriage. Marcus, honey, what you did was wrong, but your reasons... Maybe Thunder understood your reasons better than any of us did. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. when Dr. Santos allowed Marcus to see Thunder in the recovery stall. The bull was awake but groggy, his massive frame looking even more vulnerable, surrounded by clean, white walls and modern medical equipment. When Marcus approached the stall door, Thunder's head lifted with visible effort, his dark eyes searching until they found the familiar face. "Hey, boy," Marcus said softly, his voice breaking on the simple words. "Look at you, clean and warm and safe." He reached through the stall bars to touch Thunder's forehead, the first time he'd made physical contact with the bull in 10 years. Thunder leaned into the touch with such obvious relief that everyone present felt their hearts clench. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for without realizing it, the moment when healing could finally begin for both the captor and the captive. But the healing process would prove more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Over the following days, Thunder's physical condition improved dramatically. His wounds began to heal, his appetite returned, and his weight started to increase. However, his psychological recovery revealed depths of trauma that challenged everything the veterinary team thought they knew about animal behavior. Thunder refused to leave his stall. The door stood open, leading to a spacious paddock with grass and sunshine, but he would not cross the threshold. Dr. Santos consulted with animal behaviorists from across the country, all of whom agreed that Thunder was displaying classic symptoms of institutionalization, the same psychological condition seen in human prisoners who'd been confined for extended periods. His cage became his world, explained Dr. Rachel Kim, a specialist in animal psychology who'd flown in from Colorado to consult on Thunder's case. For 10 years, that confined space represented safety, predictability, survival. The open door represents the unknown, and the unknown feels more dangerous than the familiar suffering. The media attention reached a fever pitch when footage emerged of Thunder cowering in the corner of his stall, while a beautiful green pasture lay just beyond his reach. The image became a metaphor that resonated far beyond animal welfare. Here was a creature so damaged by his circumstances that he couldn't accept freedom when it was offered. Marcus visited every day, driving the 3 hours from his ranch to Austin and back, sometimes staying overnight in his truck in the hospital parking lot. The insurance money Patricia had forced him to claim was more than enough to cover Thunder's medical expenses, but Marcus seemed less concerned with the financial cost than with what he saw as his ongoing responsibility to see Thunder through to recovery. "I put him in that cage," Marcus told Sarah during one of their conversations in the hospital cafeteria. "I have to be the one to help him learn how to leave it." It was Ethel Thompson who suggested the solution that would ultimately save them both. "Marcus needs to go into that stall and stay with Thunder," she announced during one of the daily progress meetings. "Not as a visitor, but as a companion. Thunder learned to survive by depending on Marcus's presence. Maybe he needs to learn independence the same way." Dr. Santos was initially resistant to the idea. "Mr. Sullivan, Thunder weighs nearly 2,000 pounds. If he becomes agitated or confused—" "He won't hurt me," Marcus said with absolute certainty. "Thunder's never tried to hurt me, not once in 10 years, even when he had every reason to." The experiment began the next morning. Marcus entered Thunder's stall with a sleeping bag, a cooler of food, and his father's letter, which he'd been carrying everywhere since the day he'd first read it. He settled into the far corner of the stall, close enough for Thunder to see him, but far enough away to avoid crowding the massive bull. For the first day, they simply coexisted in the same space, each taking comfort in the other's presence while struggling with their own demons. Marcus read his father's letter aloud repeatedly, sometimes to Thunder, sometimes to himself, as if the words could somehow rewrite the past 10 years. By the second day, Thunder had moved closer, eventually lying down near enough to Marcus that the man could reach out and touch the bull's flank. They slept that way, damaged creatures finding solace in shared suffering and the tentative hope that healing might be possible. On the third day, Marcus stood up and walked to the stall door. Thunder watched with obvious anxiety as the man who'd been his anchor for a decade moved toward the exit. But instead of leaving, Marcus simply stood in the doorway, 1 foot inside the stall and 1 foot in the paddock beyond. "Come on, Thunder," he said quietly. "Let's take this one step at a time." The revelation came on a Tuesday morning when Dr. Santos arrived at the hospital to find Thunder collapsed in his stall, his breathing labored and his temperature spiking to dangerous levels. Marcus, who had been sleeping beside the bull for 6 days, was cradling Thunder's massive head in his lap, tears streaming down his face as he whispered apologies that seemed to echo from the depths of his soul. "He's dying," Marcus said without looking up as the medical team rushed into the stall. "After everything we've been through, after all the hope, he's dying anyway." Dr. Santos's examination revealed what they'd all feared, but none had wanted to acknowledge. Thunder's body was shutting down not from infection or injury, but from something far more insidious. His heart rate was erratic, his breathing shallow, and his blood work showed stress markers that defied medical explanation. The bull was dying of what could only be described as a broken heart. "I've seen this before in extreme cases," Dr. Santos explained to the gathered team, her voice heavy with professional defeat. "When an animal has been traumatized beyond their capacity to recover, sometimes the body simply gives up. Thunder's physical wounds are healing, but the psychological damage runs too deep." The news spread through the hospital with devastating speed. The families who had been maintaining vigil in the waiting room received the update in stunned silence. Emma Rodriguez, the 8-year-old who had driven from San Antonio with her parents, began crying with the innocent grief of a child who still believed that love should be enough to heal any wound. But it was Ethel Thompson who challenged the medical consensus with the fury of someone who had spent 40 years refusing to accept defeat in the face of suffering. "That bull is not dying of a broken heart," she announced, her voice cutting through the despair like a surgeon's blade. "He's dying of guilt." The statement was so unexpected that everyone in the room turned to stare at the elderly veterinarian. Ethel continued with the calm authority of someone who had finally recognized a pattern she should have seen years earlier. "Thunder isn't just institutionalized, he's codependent. For 10 years, his entire existence has revolved around taking care of Marcus emotionally. Thunder stayed in that cage, not because he was afraid of freedom, but because he believed Marcus needed him to stay. He's dying now because he thinks Marcus still needs him to suffer." The psychological complexity of what Ethel was suggesting defied everything they thought they knew about animal behavior. But as Marcus looked down at Thunder's labored breathing, he understood with crystalline clarity that the elderly woman was right. "You're dying for me," Marcus whispered to Thunder, his voice breaking with the weight of understanding. "All these years, you've been suffering because you thought that's what I needed. You think if you get better, if you're happy, then I'll have to face what really happened to Dad." Thunder's dark eyes opened at the sound of Marcus's voice, and in their depths was an intelligence and understanding that transcended species. The bull was indeed dying, but not from trauma or neglect. He was dying from the same psychological prison that had held Marcus captive for 10 years. Dr. Santos watched this interaction with growing amazement. "In 30 years of veterinary medicine, I've never seen anything like this. Thunder has essentially been in therapy with Marcus for a decade, absorbing his guilt and trauma as if it were his own." The breakthrough came when Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He stood up in Thunder's stall, his legs shaky from days of sitting vigil, and walked to the open door that led to the paddock. But instead of stopping at the threshold as he had for the past week, he walked outside into the sunshine. "Thunder!" he called back toward the stall, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "I'm going to tell you what really happened the day Dad died, and I need you to listen because I've never told anyone the whole truth." The bull lifted his head with visible effort, his breathing still labored, but his attention focused entirely on Marcus. Dr. Santos and the medical team stepped back, recognizing that they were about to witness something that went far beyond veterinary medicine. "It was September 15th, 10 years ago," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the paddock like a confession. "We'd been watching the weather reports all week, knew there was flooding upstream. Dad wanted to move the herd to higher ground, but I convinced him to wait one more day. I said the forecast might be wrong, that we could save the expense of moving them if the water didn't rise." Thunder struggled to his feet, his massive frame swaying with weakness but his determination unmistakable. Step by agonizing step, he began moving toward the stall door, drawn by something in Marcus's voice that demanded his presence. "The water came faster than anyone predicted," Marcus continued, tears streaming down his face as Thunder approached the threshold between captivity and freedom. "Dad and I were trying to get the cattle out when we realized you were still in the far pasture. You were trapped by a fallen tree, couldn't get to high ground on your own." Thunder reached the doorway and stopped, his hooves just inches from crossing into the paddock. The bull's breathing was still labored, but his eyes were locked on Marcus with an intensity that made everyone present hold their breath. "Dad went back for you," Marcus said, his voice breaking completely. "I begged him not to, told him it was just one bull, that we could replace you. But he said Benjamin Sullivans don't abandon family, and you were family. He went into that flood to save you, and the current took him. He drowned saving your life, and I blamed you for letting him do it." The confession hung in the air like a physical presence, 10 years of guilt and misplaced anger finally given voice. Thunder took one step forward, then another, his hooves touching grass for the first time in a decade. "But the truth is," Marcus continued, walking slowly toward Thunder as the bull ventured further into the paddock, "Dad didn't die because of you. He died because of me. Because I was too much of a coward to go back for you myself. Because I let my father do what I should have done. I've been punishing you for 10 years because I couldn't bear to punish myself." Thunder reached Marcus in the center of the paddock, his massive head lowering until it rested against the man's chest. For the first time in 10 years, they were both free of the cage that guilt had built around them. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered into Thunder's ear. "I'm so sorry for what I did to both of us." Dad saved you because he loved you, and I dishonored his sacrifice by making it meaningless. But I understand now. He didn't die for nothing. He died for love, and that's the most meaningful death anyone can have." Dr. Santos approached them slowly, her medical bag in hand, but what she found defied every principle of veterinary science she'd ever learned. Thunder's breathing had stabilized, his heart rate was returning to normal, and the stress markers that had been killing him were dissipating like morning mist. "I don't understand what just happened here," she admitted to Ethel, who was watching the scene with the satisfied expression of someone whose diagnosis had been proven correct. "Healing," Ethel replied simply. "Real healing doesn't happen in the body until it happens in the heart. Thunder was dying because he thought Marcus needed him to carry that guilt. Now that Marcus has taken responsibility for his own pain, Thunder is free to recover." As the sun set over the Austin Animal Hospital, Thunder took his first tentative steps around the paddock, his legs weak from years of confinement but growing stronger with each stride. Marcus walked beside him, not as a captor or keeper, but as a companion on the journey toward healing. The viral videos that emerged from that evening showed a different kind of miracle than anyone had expected. Instead of a dramatic rescue or medical intervention, the world witnessed the quiet power of truth, forgiveness, and the profound connection between two damaged souls learning to live free. By midnight, Thunder was grazing peacefully in the moonlight, and Marcus had called Patricia to tell her he was ready to come home and start rebuilding the life his guilt had torn apart. The cage was finally truly empty. 6 months later, the Sullivan Ranch looked like a different world entirely. The spring rains had been generous, transforming the drought-stricken landscape into rolling hills of emerald grass that stretched toward the horizon like a promise fulfilled. Where Thunder's prison had once stood, Marcus had planted a memorial garden, not for the bull, who was very much alive, but for the decade they'd both lost to guilt and misplaced grief. Thunder himself had become something of a local legend. At nearly 1,600 pounds, he'd regained most of his original mass, his gray coat now gleaming with health and his distinctive Brahman hump restored to its proud prominence. But more than his physical recovery, it was Thunder's spirit that amazed everyone who met him. The bull, who had once cowered in a cage, now approached visitors with curiosity and gentleness, allowing children to pet his massive flanks while their parents watched in wonder. Sarah Mitchell had become a regular visitor to the ranch, officially in her capacity as a follow-up inspector, but really because she'd found something at the Sullivan property that she'd been searching for without knowing it, a sense of purpose that went beyond simply rescuing animals. She was helping Marcus establish a therapeutic ranch program, using Thunder's story as inspiration for other trauma survivors, both human and animal. "Thunder's not just a success story," Sarah explained to a group of veterans she'd brought to visit the ranch. "He's proof that healing is possible, even when the damage seems too deep to overcome. Sometimes the strongest among us are those who've learned to carry pain and still choose love." The veterans, many dealing with their own invisible cages of PTSD and survivor's guilt, found something profoundly healing in Thunder's presence. The bull seemed to understand trauma in a way that transcended species, offering his calm strength to those who needed it most. One Marine who hadn't spoken about his experiences in Afghanistan spent an entire afternoon sitting in Thunder's pasture, finally breaking his silence as the gentle giant grazed nearby. Marcus had undergone his own transformation that went far beyond the obvious improvements in his sobriety and physical health. The man who had hidden from the world for 10 years had become an advocate for animal welfare and trauma recovery, speaking at conferences and sharing Thunder's story with anyone who would listen. But perhaps more importantly, he'd learned to forgive himself, a process that had been far more difficult than forgiving Thunder. "The hardest part wasn't admitting what I'd done," Marcus told a group of psychology students from the University of Texas who'd come to study Thunder's case. The hardest part was accepting that my father's death had meaning, that his sacrifice saved Thunder's life, and that dishonoring that sacrifice by punishing Thunder was the real betrayal of his memory. Patricia had moved back to the ranch in March, not as Marcus's wife, they were taking that reconciliation slowly, but as his partner in building something meaningful from the ashes of their shared tragedy. She'd brought her expertise in social work to the therapeutic program, helping design protocols that ensured both human and animal participants were protected and supported throughout their healing journeys. The insurance money that had sat untouched for 10 years had been put to work in ways Benjamin Sullivan would have approved of wholeheartedly. A new barn, designed with Thunder's input, the bull had clear preferences about where he wanted to spend his time, housed 3 other rescued Brahman cattle, all of whom had been saved from various forms of neglect or abuse. Thunder had appointed himself their unofficial guardian, teaching them to trust humans again with the patience of someone who understood the journey intimately. Ethel Thompson had found her own second chance in Thunder's story. At 74, she'd come out of retirement to serve as the ranch's consulting veterinarian, her decades of experience proving invaluable in treating animals whose trauma manifested in complex physical and psychological symptoms. More personally, she'd begun working through her own grief over her son's death, finally understanding that his riding accident had been just that, an accident, not a judgment on her skills as a mother or a veterinarian. I spent 40 years healing animals, Ethel reflected during a quiet moment with Sarah as they watched Thunder teaching a young bull how to approach humans safely. But I never understood that sometimes the healer needs healing too. Thunder taught me that carrying guilt doesn't honor the dead. Living fully honors them. The ranch's transformation had attracted attention from far beyond Texas. Documentary filmmakers, researchers, and animal welfare advocates made regular pilgrimages to see Thunder and learn about the innovative therapy programs Marcus and Patricia had developed. But perhaps the most meaningful visitors were the families who came seeking hope for their own seemingly impossible situations. Emma Rodriguez, now 9 years old, had become Thunder's most devoted young friend. Her family made the drive from San Antonio every month, and Emma had appointed herself Thunder's official biographer, documenting his recovery in a series of drawings and stories that captured the magic of his transformation better than any academic study. Thunder teaches people that it's okay to be scared, Emma explained to a news reporter who was doing a follow-up story on the bull's recovery. But he also teaches them that being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. He was scared to leave his cage, but he did it anyway because love is stronger than scared. The reporter had intended to write a simple, feel-good piece about animal rescue, but Emma's insight had captured something profound about the human condition that resonated far beyond the expected audience. The article, titled "Love is Stronger Than Scared," became one of the most shared pieces about trauma recovery in social media history. As autumn approached, marking nearly a year since Thunder's rescue, the ranch prepared for its biggest event yet, a gathering of trauma survivors, their families, and the professionals who worked with them. Thunder would be the guest of honor, but the real celebration was about the community that had grown around his story. The lives that had been touched and transformed by witnessing his journey from captivity to freedom. Standing in the pasture where Thunder now spent his days, Marcus felt his father's presence more strongly than he had since the day Benjamin died. The bull grazed peacefully nearby, occasionally lifting his massive head to check on the small group of children who were playing in the grass under their parents' watchful eyes. "I think Dad would be proud," Patricia said, slipping her hand into Marcus's as they watched Thunder demonstrate to a nervous rescue calf that humans could be trusted. "I know he would be," Marcus replied, his voice steady with the kind of peace that can only come from choosing love over guilt, healing over punishment, freedom over the familiar comfort of self-imposed cages. Thunder looked up at the sound of their voices, his dark eyes holding all the wisdom of a creature who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is teaching others how to be free. In that moment, as the Texas sun painted the sky in shades of hope, it was impossible to tell who had rescued whom. The cage was not just empty now, it had been transformed into something beautiful, a garden where new life grew from the soil of old pain, tended by hearts that had learned the most important lesson of all, that healing is always possible, and love is indeed stronger than fear. Sometimes the cages we build for ourselves are stronger than any prison bars. Thunder's story reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, even when we've spent years punishing ourselves for things beyond our control. How many of us carry guilt like Marcus did, believing that our pain somehow honors those we've lost? But Thunder taught us something profound. Our loved ones don't want us to suffer in their memory. They want us to live fully, to love deeply, to find joy again. At 55, 60, even 70, we still have time to unlock the cages of regret, grief, and self-blame that keep us from experiencing the happiness we deserve. Marcus thought he was protecting his father's memory by staying trapped in guilt. But real honor comes from choosing healing over hurt, love over fear. Thunder waited 10 years for Marcus to forgive himself. Maybe it's time we stopped waiting too. Every sunrise offers us the choice: stay in the familiar darkness of old wounds or step into the light of possibility. Your story isn't over. Your capacity for joy isn't gone. Like Thunder learning to run free again, you can still discover that love truly is stronger than fear. What cage of guilt or regret have you been carrying that might be keeping you from happiness? What would stepping into your own pasture of freedom look like for you? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.